Stop right there. Put the bags down.
The case stays with me. It's classified.
I don't care what you say it is. Put it down.
You can verify my
I'm
credentials
not
and call a
authorized
supervisor.
to surrender classified material.
This airport cop thought he was stopping another passenger he could push around for a few minutes. He had no idea the man in front of him was a black military commander carrying classified federal material after being pulled out of a live overseas operation. He saw the uniform, the injuries, the case, and still decided none of it made sense to him. That decision wrecked his career and dragged his department into a federal case. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you like stories where abuse of power gets exposed in public, like and subscribe. This one started with a stop in a crowded airport and ended with prison time. Adrian Cross was moving through Phoenix Sky Harbor on a Sunday evening, trying to make a connection and finish the last part of a military transfer. Less than 72 hours earlier, he had been extracted from hostile territory after a combat mission went bad. Several men had been wounded, command changed his route, and sent him back to the United States under tight security. He looked like a man who had just come out of something serious. He had not slept properly in almost 2 days. His right hand was wrapped from an injury during extraction. A cut near his eyebrow was still healing. Under his arm, he carried a sealed, classified case. Over his shoulder, he had a duffel bag packed in a rush before transport. He wasn't looking for attention. He wasn't talking to anyone. He wasn't causing any problem. He was walking from one terminal connection to the next. The terminal was full. Delayed passengers were crowded near the gates. Families were coming back from trips. Flight crews were moving between terminals. Announcements kept cutting through the noise. People were checking phones, dragging luggage, and trying to get home. Adrian kept moving through all of it at a steady pace. His uniform was still neat. His face showed the strain. Anyone paying normal attention would have seen an injured officer in transit. Officer Brent Hollis saw something else. Hollis had spent years in airport policing. He also had a reputation, even if the department never dealt with it properly. Black and Latino travelers had filed complaints before. They said he stopped them more often, pushed harder, and treated routine encounters like personal tests. None of that had changed his position. When he saw Adrian, he made a decision before saying a word. In his mind, Adrian did not look like the kind of man who should be traveling alone with high-level military credentials and a sealed case. That was the real reason for the stop. Hollis stepped in front of him near the gate corridor and blocked his path. Foot traffic had to move around them. Then he started questioning him. He wanted to know where Adrian was coming from, what was in the case, why he was injured, and why he was traveling alone. Adrian stayed calm. He gave only the information he was allowed to give. He presented military identification and travel documents. He explained that he was in transit under orders. He also made one point clear right away. The sealed case contained classified military material, and he could not hand it over to civilian law enforcement without proper authorization. That should have settled the next step. A professional officer would verify the credentials through the proper channel and move on. Hollis didn't do that. He looked over Adrian's identification with open suspicion. He turned it over in his hands and studied it like he had already decided it was fake. He did not try to verify it through official channels. He kept talking to Adrian like he had caught him in a lie. Adrian didn't rise to it. He stayed controlled and repeated only what he was authorized to say. When it became clear Hollis was not handling this properly, Adrian asked for a supervisor. That request made the stop worse. Hollis treated it like a challenge. His tone got sharper. He moved closer. He repeated the same questions and kept pushing for the case. Adrian gave him nothing extra. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He did not make any sudden move. Then Hollis ordered him to put everything on the ground, including the sealed case. Adrian lowered the duffel bag. He kept hold of the case. Calmly, he repeated that he was not authorized to surrender classified military material. That was a lawful answer. It was also the moment Hollis stopped acting like this was a security check and started turning it into a power play. People nearby had started watching, not because Adrian made a scene, Because Hollis did. His voice carried across the gate area. Travelers slowed down. A few stopped completely. Some looked at Adrian's uniform, then at the officer, and could tell the situation was going in the wrong direction. Adrian asked for a supervisor again. Hollis ignored him and repeated the order. Adrian held his position, still calm, still compliant in every way that did not violate military protocol. He had shown identification. He had explained his status. He had not threatened anyone. He had not resisted. None of that mattered to Hollis anymore. At that point, the stop was no longer about security. It was about control. Hollis had decided Adrian was not the man his credentials said he was, and he was going to force the situation until Adrian submitted. That was the last moment before it turned physical. Hollis made the move first. He grabbed Adrian's injured arm and twisted hard. Not a guiding hold. Not a standard control move on a resisting suspect. He went straight at the damaged arm of a man who had been standing still, speaking clearly, and asking for a supervisor. Adrian lost balance immediately. His shoulder hit the floor first, then his knees, then the side of his face. The bandaging on his hand tore open. The cut near his eyebrow split again on impact. The sealed case came loose and slid several feet across the polished tile toward a waiting area full of passengers. That changed the scene instantly. A few seconds earlier, people had seen a tense stop. Now they were watching an injured, uniformed commander bleeding on an airport floor, while an officer yelled at him to stay down even though he had not rushed anyone, swung at anyone, or tried to run. A second officer moved in and helped pin him instead of stopping it. That made it worse. Adrian kept saying he was not resisting. He said it clearly. He said it while face down. He said it while one arm was pinned and the other was already injured. He did not threaten them. He did not curse them out. He did not try to turn the struggle into some loud scene. He kept trying to state the obvious facts while they kept forcing him lower. People around them started reacting all at once. Some froze, some backed away. Some started shouting that he was not doing anything. Others pulled out their phones and began recording. That part mattered because once multiple angles hit the internet later, the department lost any chance to hide behind a vague incident report. And the Bodycam made it even worse for Hollis. It captured the full sequence: the questioning, the ignored credentials, the request for a supervisor, the refusal to verify anything properly, the order to surrender the sealed case, then the takedown. Anyone reviewing that footage could see the gap between Adrian's behavior and Hollis's response. There was no real threat to explain it away. The sealed case sitting exposed on the terminal floor turned this from misconduct into something much bigger. That case was not supposed to be out in public like that. Not in the middle of a crowded airport corridor. Not within sight of random travelers holding up phones. Not after a civilian officer had forced it out of the hands of the person assigned to move it. Nobody around that scene knew what was in it. That was the point. They were not supposed to know. But now airport police had created a public security problem where there had been none. Hollis still acted like he was in control. That's what reckless officers do when they realize too late that they've gone too far. They double down and hope force will cover the mistake. He kept shouting commands at Adrian as if noise could justify what the footage was already showing. It couldn't. Passengers had gathered far enough back to avoid getting dragged in, but close enough to see everything clearly. Some were yelling for the officers to stop. One man kept saying Adrian had already shown ID. A woman near the gate seating said they were hurting an injured serviceman for no reason. A flight crew member stood off to the side and watched the sealed case with the kind of expression people get when they know something is deeply wrong, even if they do not know the exact rules being broken. Then Sergeant Lena Mercer arrived. She did not need a full briefing. One look told her enough. She saw Adrian on the floor in cuffs, bleeding through reopened injuries. She saw his military identification being treated like it meant nothing. She saw the sealed case separated from him in a public terminal. She saw passengers recording. She saw the second officer helping hold down a man who was clearly under control already. Mercer understood the scale of the mistake immediately. This was no longer a local airport stop. This was a wounded military commander in uniform, in transit under orders, handled with force in public, while carrying classified federal material. That alone was catastrophic. Add Bodycam, civilian recordings, and a terminal full of witnesses. And now the whole thing was already bigger than the department. Mercer stepped in fast and took over. She ordered the officers to remove the handcuffs. She secured the sealed case herself instead of leaving it exposed. She demanded Adrian's credentials back. She called Airport Command and started locking the scene down before anyone could keep freelancing and make it worse. Hollis tried to hold onto the stop for a few more seconds. Officers like him always do. He started framing it as a suspicious encounter, tried to justify the force, and pushed the idea that Adrian had failed to comply. Mercer shut that down. The facts were too visible. Adrian had produced valid military identification. He had explained the limits of his authority over the case. He had asked for a supervisor. He had lowered the duffel bag when ordered. He had not made any threatening move. The public had seen all of that. The cameras had seen all of that. Hollis was standing inside his own problem with no room left to reshape it. Adrian was helped back to his feet. By then, blood was visible on the floor where he had hit. His hand wrapping had come apart. The cut near his eyebrow was open again. He looked like a man who had just survived one extraction overseas and then got slammed onto an airport floor back home by people who could not accept what his credentials already proved. Mercer got medical support moving, but she also had another crisis on her hands. The case had to be secured. The chain around it had to be documented. Every second after that takedown created more questions. Who had touched it? Who had been close to it? What had been visible? What had been recorded? Which officers had handled material they had no authority to handle? That is where local control started ending. Airport Command got pulled in. Then military contacts. Then federal personnel. Fast. This wasn't because Adrian was important in some vague, symbolic way. It was because the stop triggered 3 separate disasters at once. A civil rights problem, an assault problem, a classified material problem. Once the right people were notified, the tone changed immediately. Nobody from the military side treated this like a misunderstanding. Nobody from the federal side saw it as a routine use of force question. The facts were too bad, too clear, and too well recorded. And Hollis had another problem coming that he still didn't fully understand. This was not going to stay inside the airport. Passengers were already uploading clips before supervisors finished their first calls. The footage showed enough to spark outrage on its own. A black officer in uniform, visibly injured, pinned to the ground while saying he was not resisting. Once people learned he was a military commander carrying classified material under orders, the story was going to hit a much harder level. By the end of that night, the department was no longer asking how to explain the incident. It was asking how much video was out there, how many prior complaints were now going to come back, and whether Brent Hollis had just exposed years of things they had chosen not to deal with. The story got out before the department could control it. By that night, passenger videos were already moving across social media. People did not need a long explanation to understand what they were looking at. A black officer in uniform, visibly injured, was taken down in a crowded airport while saying he was not resisting. That alone was bad enough. Then more details came out. He was not just any service member. He was Commander Adrian Cross. He had just returned from an overseas combat operation. He was carrying classified material under orders when airport police put him on the floor and let that case slide across a public terminal. After that, the department lost the story. Bodycam footage made it worse. It backed up the main facts instead of helping the officers. It showed Adrian presenting valid military identification. It showed him staying calm. It showed him asking for a supervisor. It showed Hollis pushing past all of that and turning a controlled stop into a forced takedown. Once investigators saw the footage, there was no serious way to frame this as confusion. Military authorities moved fast. Federal investigators did too. They were not just looking at the assault. They were looking at the exposure of classified material, the failure to verify federal credentials, and the fact that a civilian airport officer had overridden basic procedure because he did not believe the person in front of him. That point stayed at the center of everything. Hollis had not uncovered a fake officer. He had ignored a real one. That made the case cleaner for prosecutors later, because it stripped away the usual excuses. This was not a fast-moving fight, not a bad split-second read, not a crowded scene misfire. He had time to look at the identification, time to call it in, time to get a supervisor, time to slow down. He chose none of that. And once the case got attention, older stories started coming back. Black travelers, Latino travelers. Men stopped near gates. Families questioned too aggressively. Passengers who said Hollis acted like ordinary movement through the airport was suspicious when the wrong people were doing it. Some had filed complaints and heard nothing back. Some never filed because they assumed nothing would happen. Some came forward only after seeing Adrian's case and realizing this officer had been doing the same thing for years. That opened the next problem. Investigators pulled internal records, complaint logs, email traffic, shift notes, prior review summaries. What they found was ugly, but not surprising. Hollis had not been some unknown risk hidden deep inside the system. Supervisors had known he generated repeated complaints tied to race. They had known he escalated ordinary encounters. They had known his stops were not affecting all travelers the same way. He stayed in position anyway. Why? Because on paper, he looked productive. He made stops. He wrote reports. He created numbers management could point to. That matters in bad departments more than judgment ever does. A reckless officer who fills spreadsheets often gets protected longer than a careful one who avoids bad stops in the first place. So this stopped being one-man misconduct. It turned into a department case. Federal investigators started asking why earlier complaints had gone nowhere, why no one had corrected the pattern, why someone with that history remained in a public-facing airport role. Internal leadership had weak answers because there were no good ones. The deeper the review went, the clearer it became that Hollis had been allowed to operate this way, because the system around him tolerated it. Adrian stayed disciplined through all of it. He got medical treatment. His hand had to be rewrapped. The reopened cut near his eyebrow was documented along with bruising from the takedown. He gave his statement carefully and through the right channels. He did not overstate anything. He did not need to. The footage did the work. The witnesses did the work. The records did the work. That helped him. People trust the person who keeps the facts straight while everyone else starts scrambling. Adrian did that from the beginning. Same tone in the terminal. Same tone after. He said what happened, what he had shown, what he had refused, and why. No extra drama. No performance. Just a clean record against a dirty one. The public response kept building. Veterans groups spoke up. Civil rights attorneys spoke up. Former travelers who had dealt with Hollis started sharing their own stories publicly. Local reporters started pulling complaint histories and asking questions the department had avoided for years. Once that happened, airport leadership could not hide behind internal review language anymore. The issue was out in the open and widening. And Hollis was done, whether he understood it yet or not. He was pulled from duty first, then suspended, then formally fired once the early reviews and footage lined up. Losing the badge was only the start. The criminal side was moving too. Federal prosecutors were already looking at the assault, the civil rights angle, and the misuse of authority under color of law. That combination was serious. Because now the government was not just saying he handled a stop badly, it was saying he used official power to unlawfully target, detain, and assault someone who had done nothing to justify it. That is a different level of case. Harder to explain away, harder to defend in front of a jury. The classified case made it even worse for him. He had no authority to demand it the way he did. No authority to force that transfer in the middle of a terminal. No authority to create the security risk that followed. Once federal personnel mapped out the chain of events, that became another piece of proof that Hollis was not acting carefully or lawfully. He was forcing compliance first and thinking later. That works until cameras are rolling and the victim's paperwork is real. Then everything flips. By that point, the airport department was no longer dealing with one scandal. It was dealing with three at once: a public civil rights scandal, a federal criminal case, an internal exposure problem involving years of ignored warning signs. Leadership started making defensive statements, but they sounded hollow because the facts were already ahead of them. The footage had pinned them down, and the longer the review went, the clearer it became that Adrian Cross had walked into that terminal, carrying classified material from a dangerous mission, only to run into the one kind of threat he should not have had to deal with back home: an officer who thought his own bias outranked the credentials in his hand. Once the federal case moved forward, Hollis was finished. The video showed Adrian presenting valid military ID, staying calm, asking for a supervisor, and refusing only one thing: handing over classified material without authorization. That was legal. Hollis ignored all of it and used force anyway. Prosecutors built the case around that choice. They showed he had time to verify the credentials and chose not to. He had time to call a supervisor and refused. He treated Adrian like a liar because he did not believe a black man in front of him could actually hold that level of military authority. Then the old complaints came back. Black and Latino travelers described the same pattern: aggressive stops, humiliation, suspicion with no real basis. Internal records showed supervisors already knew Hollis had a history and kept him in that airport role anyway. That hurt the department badly. Now it was no longer one bad stop. It was a pattern they had protected. Hollis was fired, lost his badge, and was prosecuted in federal court. The Bodycam, passenger videos, witness statements, and prior complaints left him little room. He was convicted on charges tied to unlawful assault, civil rights violations, and abuse of authority. He was sent to prison for several years. Adrian was fully cleared and backed by the official record. His injuries were documented. His account matched the footage. Military leadership confirmed he had acted within protocol the whole time. There was also a large civil settlement. The department had to change procedures after that. Complaint reviews were tightened. Body cam audits increased. Officers with repeated bias complaints got closer scrutiny. Leadership was forced to answer for why Hollis had been left in place for so long. That is what made this case bigger than one officer. Hollis thought he was stopping someone he could pressure without consequences. Instead, he picked a military commander with valid credentials, a clean record, witnesses, body cam footage, and a chain of command that reached far above him. That ended his career, exposed his department, and sent him to prison. What would you have done if you saw this happen in the terminal? Put it in the comments. Share the story with somebody who would want to hear it, and subscribe for more.
Now set the case down, now, and show me your ID again.
I already showed you I'm FBI. That case is classified. You need a supervisor and
No,
proper
you
verification.
need to do what I'm telling you.
I'm not fighting you. I'm telling you can't take federal classified
Stop
material.
This airport officer thought he was stopping an ordinary traveler he could question in public and control on the spot. But he had no idea the man in front of him was Special Agent Jordan Hayes of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, moving classified material through Dallas-Fort Worth after being pulled out of an overseas counterterrorism operation. He saw the credentials and still treated the whole thing like an act. He heard the warning about classified federal property and kept pushing anyway. That decision turned a gate corridor stop into an assault on a federal agent, a public exposure of sensitive material, and the incident that finally brought years of buried complaints back to the surface. Tell me where you are watching from, and if you follow stories about profiling, abuse of authority, and real consequences when somebody in uniform goes too far, like the video, and subscribe. Jordan Hayes had almost nothing left in the tank when Officer Tyler Grayson stopped him inside a crowded connection area at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. Jordan had been pulled out of a dangerous overseas operation with almost no notice. He had spent close to 2 days awake. His hand was wrapped from an injury during extraction. He was carrying a sealed classified case that had to reach cleared federal personnel without delay. He was not looking for help, conversation, or attention. He was moving from one terminal connection to the next and trying to finish the last piece of an operation that nobody around him was cleared to understand. There was nothing dramatic about the way he moved through the terminal. He kept his pace steady. He stayed focused on the route ahead. He did not stop to argue with staff or draw attention to himself. To most people nearby, he was just another exhausted traveler trying to make a connection. Grayson saw something else. He noticed the hard case first, then the credentials, then Jordan himself. A black man, tired, injured, carrying federal identification, and moving like he expected not to be interrupted. Grayson did not take that as a sign to verify carefully. He took it as something he did not believe. That was the real reason for the stop. He stepped into Jordan's path, near the gate corridor, and forced the encounter in front of passing travelers. From the start, his tone was aggressive. He did not approach like a man trying to sort out a concern. He approached like a man who had already decided he had caught somebody pretending to be more important than he was. Jordan answered him directly. He identified himself as a federal agent. He presented credentials. He explained that he was in transit on official business, and that the sealed case contained classified material. He also made clear that the case could not be opened or surrendered without proper authorization. That should have moved the situation into verification through command. Grayson did not do that. He looked at the credentials and treated them like something fake until proven real. He kept pressing Jordan in the same hostile tone. He questioned him as if the credentials were a prop, and the case was something he had the right to take just because he demanded it. He was not trying to solve a problem. He was trying to force compliance in public. Jordan did not match that energy. He stayed controlled. He repeated the same point in plain terms. The case was classified. There was a process for verification. Grayson did not have authority to take federal material because he felt suspicious. That answer bothered Grayson more than anything else. A man like that can handle uncertainty better than refusal. Once Jordan made it clear that he was not handing over the case without proper authority, Grayson stopped acting like this was about airport security and started acting like it was about his pride. He moved closer. He raised the pressure. People nearby started noticing the stop because Grayson was making it impossible not to notice. Travelers slowed down. Some kept walking and looked back. Others stayed near the seating area and watched. The whole thing could still have been contained with one smart decision. Call a supervisor, run the verification the right way, keep the scene quiet. Grayson chose the opposite. A second officer came over and joined him. He did not calm things down. He backed Grayson and added to the pressure. That made the scene worse, because Jordan was now dealing with two local officers who had decided that force mattered more than procedure. Jordan stayed where he was. He kept his movements limited. He repeated his identity and told them again that the case involved classified federal material. He did not threaten them. He did not insult them. He did not argue beyond the boundary that mattered. He was not surrendering the case without lawful authorization. Grayson took that as a challenge. The takedown started when he grabbed Jordan's injured arm. There was no legal reason for it. Jordan had not tried to run. He had not pushed past anyone. He had not reached for the officers. He had not made any threatening move. Grayson grabbed the one arm he knew was already damaged and used it to force Jordan down onto the terminal floor. The second officer assisted instead of stopping it. Passengers stopped in full view of the scene. Some shouted that Jordan was not resisting. Others pulled out their phones and started recording. The terminal went from normal airport noise to that specific kind of public disturbance that happens when people realize an officer is going too far and nobody around him is correcting it. Jordan hit the floor hard. The wound in his wrapped hand reopened. Blood showed on the tile. The sealed case slid across the polished floor and came to a stop near a waiting area, out in the open where strangers could see it. That was the point where the stop became a security failure, on top of everything else. Grayson had claimed the stop was about control and safety, but his actions had done the opposite. He had injured a federal agent, exposed a sealed, classified case in a crowded terminal, and created the exact public scene a competent officer would have avoided from the start. Jordan still did not fight. That mattered later because every camera caught the same basic truth. He was not resisting. He was pinned down while identifying himself and warning them that they were mishandling classified federal material. He was trying to protect the case and stop the situation from getting even worse. Grayson kept issuing commands anyway, trying to make the takedown sound justified after the fact. It did not work. Too many people were close enough to see how it actually began. Too many phones were already recording. Then the body camera captured the part that changed the entire case. During the detention, Grayson said enough to make his thinking obvious. He made it clear that he did not believe Jordan was really a federal agent. Not because the credentials had failed verification, not because Jordan had contradicted himself. He did not believe him because he had already decided that the man in front of him did not fit the role he claimed to hold. That stripped away every excuse. Once that came out, nobody could seriously frame this as a misunderstanding between agencies. It was a profiling stop that turned into a public use of force incident because one officer refused to accept that a black man in front of him had real federal authority. Jordan stayed focused on the same thing the whole time. He kept identifying himself. He kept warning them about the case. He kept his attention on limiting damage. That discipline ended up mattering because the scene was seconds away from moving out of local control. The first person on site who understood the scale of the problem was Sergeant Monica Vale. When she arrived, she did not need a long explanation. She saw Jordan bleeding on the floor in restraints. She saw federal credentials that had already been presented and ignored. She saw the sealed case separated from his control in the middle of a public terminal. She saw travelers recording from multiple angles. She heard enough of the exchange to know this was not a routine airport stop that had gone messy. It was already a departmental disaster with federal consequences. Vale reacted fast because she knew delay would make it worse. She read the scene for what it was. A local officer had detained a federal agent, used force without a valid threat, and exposed classified material in public. At that point, the question was no longer whether Grayson had made a bad call. The question was how much damage had already been done before command could shut it down. Sergeant Monica Vale understood the problem as soon as she reached the scene. She saw Jordan Hayes on the floor in restraints, bleeding from the hand. She saw federal credentials already out. She saw the sealed case separated from him in a public terminal. She saw passengers recording. That was enough. She stopped listening to Tyler Grayson's tone and started looking at facts. Jordan identified himself again. He told her he was Federal Bureau of Investigation, in transit on official business, and carrying classified material. He told her the case had to stay protected until cleared federal personnel took custody. He did not over-explain. He did not argue. He stayed focused on the same point he had been making from the start. Vale ordered the cuffs removed. That changed the whole scene immediately. Grayson had been treating Jordan like a suspect he could dominate in public. Vale treated him like what he actually was, a federal agent whose authority had been ignored and whose mission had been disrupted. She then secured the area around the case and called Airport Command. Her questions were direct. When were the credentials shown? Why was force used? Who touched the case? Why was a man identifying himself as federal on the floor instead of being verified through command? Grayson tried to say Jordan had been suspicious and uncooperative. That explanation did not hold up. The credentials were real. Witnesses were already saying Jordan had not resisted. The case had been identified as classified before the takedown. The body cameras were running. Too many facts were already fixed. Medical personnel arrived and checked Jordan's hand. The wound had reopened during the takedown. Blood was still visible on the floor. Even then, Jordan stayed focused on the transfer. He made clear that the detention had interrupted a live federal chain and that the delay itself was now part of the damage. Airport Command arrived within minutes. Once command understood that local officers had detained a Federal Bureau of Investigation agent carrying classified material, the matter stopped being a routine use of force review. It became a command-level emergency. The questions changed immediately. They wanted body camera status, witness footage, timestamps, and confirmation of when Jordan first identified himself. The answers were bad. Jordan had identified himself early. He had shown credentials. He had warned them about the case. Grayson still escalated. Force was used anyway. The case ended up exposed in public view. Civilian footage was already spreading online. Federal personnel arrived fast after that. That speed said everything. They were not responding to a minor airport dispute. They were responding to an assault on a federal agent and a public mishandling of classified material. Jordan was moved to a controlled area. His identity was verified through the channels Grayson should have used from the start. The result matched everything Jordan had said. He was Special Agent Jordan Hayes of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He was in lawful custody of the case. He was moving under active federal authority. That ended the factual dispute. From that point on, the issue was Grayson's conduct. He had ignored valid credentials, treated a federal warning like a bluff, used force without a real threat, and created a public security breach in one of the busiest airports in the country. Command pulled Grayson off the scene. The second officer was also separated. Their body cameras were flagged for review. The reports were no longer just paperwork. They were evidence. Jordan finally got what he should have gotten at the beginning: medical treatment, command recognition, and a direct path to complete the transfer. The department by then had a different problem. Video of the takedown was already online. First short clips, then longer angles, then audio clear enough to show that Jordan had identified himself, and Grayson had ignored it. Once those videos started spreading, the department lost the ability to describe it as a routine security stop. Federal supervisors looked at it even harder. One of their agents had been injured. Classified material had been exposed in public. The stop had no solid legal basis. The body camera captured language that pointed to profiling. That moved the case beyond a bad arrest. It became a civil rights issue, an abuse of authority case, and a possible criminal matter. By the end of that first response, Grayson was no longer just an officer in a viral airport clip. He was the reason federal investigators were now looking at the entire department. Once federal investigators reviewed the body camera footage, the case changed fast. At first, the airport police department tried the usual language. They described the stop as a security response in a busy terminal. They suggested the situation developed quickly. They implied the officers were reacting to uncertainty. The footage cut through that almost immediately. Jordan Hayes identified himself early. He presented credentials. He warned Tyler Grayson that the case contained classified federal material and could not be taken without proper authorization. None of that was missing from the record. The problem was not lack of information. The problem was that Grayson chose not to accept it. That detail mattered more than anything else. A mistaken stop can sometimes be defended if an officer corrects course once facts are clear. Grayson did the opposite. The clearer Jordan was, the more aggressive Grayson became. That made the review much worse for him, because investigators were not looking at a split-second judgment anymore. They were looking at a sequence: questioning, refusal to verify properly, escalation, force, public exposure of the case, injury, all after valid federal identification had already been shown. Then investigators reached the body camera audio that destroyed the department's safest defense. Grayson said enough during the detention to show that he did not reject Jordan's claim because of a failed check or some concrete contradiction. He rejected it because he did not believe a man like Jordan should have that kind of authority in the first place. He did not say it in some polished official language. He said it the way people do when their real thinking slips out under pressure. That moved the case directly into civil rights territory. Now, the issue was not just unlawful force. It was profiling tied to authority. Jordan was not stopped because of what he did. He was stopped because Grayson decided that his presence, his credentials, and his quiet certainty did not fit the role he claimed to hold. Once that became clear, the stop stopped looking questionable and started looking deliberate. Federal supervisors made that point very clear behind the scenes, and then in a more careful form in their formal communications. They were not treating this as a misunderstanding between agencies. They were treating it as an assault on a federal agent, interference with federal duty, mishandling of classified material, and a possible deprivation of rights case. That language put real pressure on the airport police department because a local use of force problem can sometimes be absorbed internally. A federal civil rights and authority abuse case cannot. The public videos kept spreading while all of this was happening. That made things worse for the department because every new clip added context. One angle showed the takedown more clearly. Another picked up the case, sliding across the floor. Another caught bystanders saying Jordan was not resisting. One of the longer videos made the timing especially damaging. People could hear Jordan identifying himself before the force happened, not after. That eliminated another possible excuse. The department could no longer claim the officers only learned who he was once he was already on the ground. The sequence was out there. So was the blood on the floor. So was the image of a sealed case sitting away from its lawful custodian, while airport police stood around it in public. By that point, the story had moved beyond local news. Federal law enforcement circles were talking about it. Civil rights attorneys were talking about it. Former airport travelers who recognized Grayson from their own encounters started paying attention. That is when an incident stops being one event and starts pulling history behind it. Internal affairs had to open a full review, but the department did not control the pace anymore. Federal investigators wanted every relevant piece of evidence: full body camera footage, dispatch logs, timestamps, radio traffic, training records, prior complaints, use of force history, supervisory notes. They were not just asking what Grayson did that day. They were asking whether the department already knew he had a pattern. That question scared people more than the video. A bad officer is one problem. A bad officer kept in place after repeated warning signs is a bigger one. Departments can isolate the first if they move quickly. The second points upward. That is why old complaints started resurfacing almost immediately. Black and Latino travelers who had filed complaints against Grayson in earlier years began contacting reporters and lawyers. Some said he had stopped them in terminals without a clear reason. Some said he had treated valid identification like it was fake. Some described the same pattern Jordan had faced: aggressive tone first, suspicion without facts, then pressure to submit in public. Not every old complaint had video. Most of these cases never do. But now people were looking at them differently because Jordan's case gave those older reports a visible structure. The pattern was no longer abstract. It had a face, a name, body camera audio, civilian footage, and a federal victim the department could not dismiss. Former victims started speaking publicly. That was the point where the department's exposure widened. It was no longer only about what Grayson did to Jordan Hayes in one airport corridor. It was about how many times Grayson had done some version of it to people with less power, less documentation, and less chance of being believed. Jordan survived the stop with federal backing and a command structure behind him. Most travelers Grayson had targeted before did not have that. That comparison hit hard. It also made Jordan's role in the story bigger than his own case. He was still the victim of the stop, but now his case was also the event that forced a buried record into the open. Then the internal emails started getting attention. Those messages did not show some dramatic conspiracy. Real institutional failure is usually more ordinary than that. What they showed was enough. Supervisors had discussed complaints about Grayson over the years. Some had flagged concerns about his approach with minority travelers. Some had noted that his stops created repeated friction and unnecessary escalation. But he kept a public-facing airport assignment anyway, because he generated high stop numbers and looked productive on paper. That kind of record is poison once it becomes public. It means the department did not just fail to spot a problem. It saw enough to worry and still protected the officer because his numbers made management look active. It means complaints were not ignored by accident. They were absorbed as the cost of keeping a certain style of policing in place. That is where the case stopped being only about Tyler Grayson. Now the focus was shifting to the people who kept him there. Supervisors, command staff, internal review processes, complaint screening, assignment decisions. Every layer that had looked at warning signs and decided they were manageable. Jordan, through all of this, still completed the transfer that day. That detail stayed important in every later account because it showed how much discipline he had maintained under pressure. He had been injured, detained, humiliated in public, and delayed during a sensitive federal movement. Even so, he stayed focused long enough to complete the mission before turning fully to the fallout. That gave the case another sharp contrast. The man treated like a threat acted with control the whole way through. The officer claiming to protect the airport was the one who created the actual breach. By the end of that stage, the department was facing pressure from every direction at once. Federal investigators, civil rights review, public outrage, media scrutiny, reopened complaints, internal emails, witness footage, body camera evidence. The stop in the terminal was over. The real collapse had started after it. The ending came fast once the records opened up. Tyler Grayson was removed from duty, then terminated. The second officer was suspended and later disciplined for assisting in the takedown instead of stopping it. Federal investigators kept the bigger case moving because this was not just about policy violations. They were reviewing civil rights violations, abuse of authority, and the handling of classified material during an unlawful detention. The department tried to isolate Grayson at first. That did not work. Old complaints from Black and Latino travelers were reopened. Former victims spoke publicly. Their stories sounded too similar to dismiss. Same aggressive tone, same disbelief, same habit of treating ordinary people of color like they had to prove they belonged in spaces where Grayson thought they did not fit. Then the internal emails became the real problem. Supervisors had known for years that Grayson generated repeated complaints. They had discussed his conduct. They had flagged concerns. He still stayed in a public-facing airport role because his stop numbers made him look productive. That shifted blame upward. The story was no longer about one reckless officer. It was about a department that tolerated him because the paperwork looked good. That brought outside pressure. Civil rights lawyers got involved. Federal review widened. Airport leadership had to answer for complaint handling, use of force oversight, and assignment decisions. The department was pushed into changing procedures for credential verification, supervisor response, and public contact review. Body camera audits were expanded, complaint files were re-examined, several supervisors were reassigned or forced out. Jordan Hayes finished the federal transfer the same day he was detained. After that, he gave his formal statement and let the evidence speak. He did not need to build the case with emotion. The video, the body camera, the witness accounts, and the department's own records already did that. What happened to him was serious on its own. What made it bigger was what it exposed. Grayson did this to the wrong man in the wrong place at the wrong time, and for once the system could not pretend it was an isolated mistake. Jordan had federal backing, documentation, witnesses, and chain of command support. Other people Grayson targeted before did not. That is why the case mattered beyond one airport stop. The lesson was simple. A badge does not turn bias into judgment. It just makes the damage larger when nobody stops it. What would you have done if you saw that happen in front of you? Have you ever watched somebody in authority push too far because they thought nobody would challenge them? Put it in the comments. Share the story with somebody who would understand it. And subscribe for more stories like this.
Run the plate and VIN.
I'm already on it. Just hang right here for me. Plate and VIN don't match. That's a problem. Dr. Mercer, I need you to step away from the car. Turn around. Hands behind your back.
This officer thought he had found an easy target. A black man in a luxury car, late evening, quiet street, badge on one side, one driver on the other. In his head, the story was already written. The car probably was not his. The documents probably would not hold up. A little pressure would expose something. What he did not realize was that he was about to create a clear record of profiling, overreach, and bad judgment, all of it captured step by step. Tell me where you are watching from, and if you like stories where abuse of authority gets exposed by facts, like the video, and subscribe. The stop happened in the medical district just after dark. Dr. Adrian Mercer was driving home after a long day at work. He had spent the day moving between surgery and hospital business. He owned the luxury car. It was legally registered. It was insured. He was not doing anything unusual. He was heading home. Officer Daniel Kessler noticed the car first. Then he noticed the driver. That was when the stop really began in his mind. He waited for a traffic reason and used a minor lane change issue to pull the car over. Dr. Adrian Mercer did exactly what a driver is supposed to do. He pulled over safely. He stayed inside. He waited for instructions. When Officer Kessler walked up to the window, he asked for license, registration, and insurance. Dr. Adrian Mercer handed them over right away. Everything matched. The name on the license matched the registration. The insurance was active. The plate matched the vehicle. That should have ended the ownership question. It did not. Officer Kessler looked over the documents and started asking questions that had nothing to do with a normal traffic stop. He wanted to know whether the car really belonged to Dr. Adrian Mercer. He asked how long he had owned it. He asked where he got it. He asked whether it was leased, financed, or borrowed. He asked where Dr. Adrian Mercer was coming from and what he did for work. The answers were calm and direct. The car was his, the paperwork was valid. There was no confusion in the documents and no sign of theft. But Officer Kessler did not treat the paperwork as proof. He treated it like something that needed to be challenged until it matched his assumption. That is what changed the stop. A normal officer checks documents to confirm facts. Kessler was doing the opposite. He had already decided the facts were wrong, and now he was looking for a way to force the stop in that direction. Dr. Adrian Mercer understood very quickly that this was not really about the lane change. He did not argue. He did not try to impress the officer. He did not start talking about status or money. He answered what he needed to answer and stayed controlled. Officer Kessler took the documents back to his patrol car and ran the checks. The vehicle did not come back stolen. The registration was current. The insurance was active. There was still no factual basis for a theft theory. He kept going anyway. Over the radio, he started describing the stop in a way that made it sound more serious than it was. He suggested there were concerns about ownership. He framed Dr. Adrian Mercer as suspicious without pointing to any real conduct that supported that label. He was not reporting a clear problem. He was setting up a version of events that might justify pushing the stop further. That mattered later because the cameras were telling a different story. The dash camera showed a routine stop. The body camera showed a driver who stayed calm, followed instructions, and gave valid documents. The radio traffic showed Officer Kessler trying to build suspicion before he had evidence for it. He returned to the car and started asking the same questions again, in slightly different ways. He was trying to catch Dr. Adrian Mercer in some inconsistency. There was none. The answers stayed the same because the facts stayed the same. At that point, the stop had already gone past what it should have been. Officer Kessler was not checking a traffic issue anymore. He was trying to make Dr. Adrian Mercer explain why he was allowed to own his own car. That was the real stop, not the lane change, not safety, not a paperwork issue. Just one officer refusing to accept what was already in front of him. Dr. Adrian Mercer did not help him stretch it into more than that. He stayed measured. He answered clearly. He did not give the officer anything that could honestly be called threatening, evasive, or disorderly. That only made Officer Kessler more determined. He went back to broad language. He talked about needing more verification. He acted like the stop still had unresolved issues, even though the basic checks had already come back clean. He kept the pressure on because he did not want to admit that the premise of the stop had failed. Then he took the next step and asked Dr. Adrian Mercer to get out of the car. Dr. Adrian Mercer complied. Outside the vehicle, he asked what the actual issue was. It was a fair question. The documents were valid. The car had not been flagged as stolen. There was no obvious reason for the stop to keep expanding. Officer Kessler did not give a clear answer. He stayed vague. He talked in general terms about ownership concerns and verification. That vagueness was important. It showed he still had no concrete basis for what he was doing. He circled the car, stalled for time, and kept trying to turn doubt into evidence. But doubt is not evidence. Disbelief is not probable cause. And a luxury car does not become suspicious just because an officer thinks the wrong person is driving it. Dr. Adrian Mercer could see what was happening. The officer was building the whole stop around a theory he could not prove. He was using the time, the uniform, and the pressure of the roadside to make that theory feel official. That is how bad stops grow, not from facts, not. From confidence backed by authority, and Officer Kessler still thought he was in control. He thought he had found someone he could push around. He thought the stop would end with the driver rattled and the officer satisfied that he had asserted control. He did not know he was standing there with cameras recording every unsupported decision. He did not know dispatch records would preserve the way he framed the stop. And he had no idea who Dr. Adrian Mercer really was in that city. At that point, to him, this was still just a driver he did not believe. That mistake was about to cost him. Officer Daniel Kessler had already stretched the stop far beyond the traffic reason he used to initiate it. By then, he was no longer checking anything in a normal way. He was trying to save the assumption that had driven the stop from the beginning. He had seen a black man in a rare car, decided that ownership did not make sense, and now he was too deep into that idea to step back cleanly. Dr. Adrian Mercer was standing outside the car, calm, cooperative, and clearly asking for a real explanation. Officer Kessler still did not have one. He had valid identification. He had valid registration. He had active insurance. The vehicle had not come back stolen. There was no actual conflict in the paperwork. So instead of pointing to facts, he kept relying on general language about verification and concern. That was the point where the stop became dangerous in a legal sense. The problem was no longer disrespect. The problem was that Kessler was holding a man on the roadside without a solid basis and trying to make that detention sound more justified than it was. He had already used the radio to frame Dr. Adrian Mercer as suspicious. Now he needed the stop to produce something that would support that framing. He started pressing harder. He asked the same ownership questions again, but now the tone was different. It sounded less like inquiry and more like accusation. He wanted details about when the car had been purchased, how it had been paid for, and why Dr. Adrian Mercer was driving through that area at that hour. None of those questions solved the real problem, because there was no real problem to solve. They were pressure questions. The goal was to force hesitation, not to clarify facts. Dr. Adrian Mercer stayed measured. He did not try to debate the officer. He did not start talking too much. He gave direct responses and kept returning to the same basic point. The vehicle belonged to him. The documents were valid, and there was no lawful reason to keep treating the car like stolen property when the records were not showing that. That answer should have forced Officer Kessler to either end the stop or admit he had nothing. He did neither. Instead, he kept expanding the suspicion. He started suggesting that even if the car had not been flagged, that did not fully settle the issue. He hinted that the paperwork could still be fraudulent. He hinted that Dr. Adrian Mercer's behavior was unusual. Those claims mattered because they later became part of the official justification. They also mattered because the footage did not support them. Dr. Adrian Mercer was not acting erratic. He was not changing his answers. He was not trying to leave. He was not interfering. The video showed a man standing still, listening, responding, and asking clear questions about the basis for what was happening. Kessler, however, had already committed himself to a narrative where calm behavior became suspicious simply because it did not help him. That is how weak cases get built. An officer starts with a conclusion, fails to find evidence, then lowers the standard until normal behavior can be described as concerning. Kessler went back to dispatch again. He requested additional confirmation on the vehicle and continued speaking in a way that made the stop sound unstable. He did not say he had the proof of theft because he could not say that honestly. He did the next closest thing. He spoke as if the possibility itself justified whatever he wanted to do next. That kind of wording is what usually gives bad arrests their first layer of cover, not facts. Just language that sounds official enough to survive until somebody reviews the actual record. Dr. Adrian Mercer understood that the stop was moving toward something worse. He asked whether he was being detained and what crime the officer believed had occurred. Those were exactly the right questions. They put pressure back on the officer to name a legal basis instead of hiding behind tone and repetition. Officer Kessler still did not give a clear answer. He moved closer to the car again, looked through the windows, circled around it, and acted like the car itself was evidence. Then he returned to Dr. Adrian Mercer and started focusing on behavior, not criminal behavior, just behavior he could label in vague terms later. He suggested Dr. Adrian Mercer was being too careful with his answers. He suggested he was being guarded. He suggested there was something off in the interaction. All of that would later collapse because the cameras showed exactly what the stop looked like. There was no visible panic, no hostility, no attempt to mislead. What Kessler called suspicious was really just a man refusing to panic in front of an officer who was fishing. At that point, Kessler had a choice. He could end the stop, issue whatever traffic warning or citation he wanted, and drive away. That option was still there. It would have been the lawful option. It would also have required him to accept that he had built the stop around a false assumption. He was not going to do that. Instead, he crossed the line. He told Dr. Adrian Mercer he was being detained on suspicion related to possible vehicle theft and fraudulent ownership documents. That was the first time he tried to turn his theory into a formal basis for action. The problem was obvious. He still had no concrete evidence for either claim. He had no stolen vehicle hit. He had no contradictory VIN return. He had no conflicting ownership record in front of him. He had no forged document identified by any actual check. He had a guess, and he had spent enough time repeating that guess to himself that he began treating it like probable cause. Dr. Adrian Mercer responded the same way he had handled the entire stop. He did not escalate. He did not resist. He asked what facts supported that detention when the records had already come back clean. Kessler did not answer in a way that could survive later review. He just kept asserting control and speaking as if authority itself made the detention lawful. Then he made the arrest. He put Dr. Adrian Mercer in handcuffs on the roadside and treated the moment as though it were the natural result of a careful investigation. It was not. It was the result of one officer refusing to let go of a biased assumption. The arrest was illegal the moment it happened because the factual basis was not there. The cameras would later make that simple. Dr. Adrian Mercer did not fight him. He did not shout. He did not give Kessler the scene he seemed to want. He stood there, let the cuffs go on, and kept asking the same clear question in different forms. What lawful basis do you have to arrest me when the vehicle is registered to me and there is no evidence it was stolen? That question hung over the whole scene. Kessler could not answer it directly because every real check had already undercut his theory. So he fell back on vague police language again. He referred to suspicious circumstances. He referred to concerns about authenticity. He referred to the need for further investigation. It sounded official in the moment. On paper and on camera, it would later look exactly like what it was: unsupported escalation. That was the mask-off moment. Up to then, he could still pretend he was being overly cautious. Once he made the arrest without evidence, that excuse started collapsing. He had taken the most serious step available to him without a lawful foundation. That is the kind of decision that destroys an officer when the record is clean enough. And the record was very clean. The body camera had captured a calm, compliant driver from the beginning. The dash footage had captured a routine stop with no visible sign of criminal conduct. The dispatch log had captured the way Kessler slowly built a story around suspicion instead of reporting concrete facts. Once all three were put together, the arrest would look exactly like profiling dressed up as police work. Kessler still did not understand how exposed he was. He was focused on control. He had handcuffed the driver. He had turned the stop into an arrest. In his head, that probably felt like confirmation that he had been right to push. Some officers mistake escalation for validation. They think that once they make the arrest itself gives the stop weight. It does not. If the basis is weak, the arrest only makes the misconduct easier to see. Dr. Adrian Mercer was placed by the patrol car, while Kessler continued trying to make the story sound stronger over the radio. He repeated concerns about ownership. He referred again to suspicious behavior. He talked as if the detention had revealed something meaningful. It had not. Nothing new had appeared. The arrest had not uncovered evidence. It had only locked in his bad judgment. Then the stop started turning against him in a way he had not expected. The name he had been treating as just another license entry began to register with other people. Dispatch looked harder. Someone higher up recognized it. The questions on the other end of the line changed. Kessler was no longer speaking into a vacuum where vague language would be accepted without thought. He still did not fully understand where that was headed. At that moment, he thought he had pushed a driver into custody and would write the rest up later. He thought the hard part was done. He did not yet realize that the arrest itself had created the biggest problem of his career, because the man he had just placed in handcuffs was not only a surgeon, he was one of the most prominent people in the city's medical system, and the first people realizing that were no longer standing on the roadside. They were listening, checking, and starting to understand just how badly the stop had gone. That was where the stop stopped being something Officer Daniel Kessler could manage by tone and confidence. Once Dr. Adrian Mercer's identity was checked more carefully, the issue changed immediately. Kessler had treated him like a driver he could keep under pressure while he searched for a reason to justify the stop. Now supervisors were looking at the same documents Kessler had already seen, and those documents were not supporting the arrest. Dr. Adrian Mercer was not only a surgeon, he owned the hospital network tied to a large part of the city's medical system. His name was widely known. That did not make the arrest wrong. The arrest was already wrong. What it did was make the department pay attention right away. A supervisor got involved, and the stop had to be explained in concrete terms. That was where Kessler's problem became obvious. The car was not reported stolen. The registration matched Dr. Adrian Mercer. The insurance was active. The driver's license matched the paperwork. There was no solid fact showing fraud, theft, or any other crime tied to the car. Kessler had still made the arrest. He tried to defend it the same way he had handled the stop. He used broad language. He said the driver's behavior raised concern. He said the ownership issue did not sit right with him. He said more verification was needed. None of that answered the real problem. He had already put handcuffs on a man without evidence that a crime had occurred. That became even clearer once the recordings were reviewed. The body camera showed Dr. Adrian Mercer staying calm, answering questions and following instructions. The dash camera showed an ordinary roadside stop with no sign of criminal conduct. The dispatch log showed Kessler shaping the stop around suspicion that he never backed up with facts. Once those pieces were compared, the arrest looked exactly as bad as it was. Dr. Adrian Mercer was eventually released, but the release did not solve anything for Kessler. The arrest had already happened. The stop had already been recorded. The department now had to deal with an officer who had escalated without lawful cause. Then Kessler made another mistake. He wrote the report as if the arrest had been supported by the encounter. He described Dr. Adrian Mercer in suspicious terms. He wrote as if there had been uncertainty about ownership for longer than there actually had been. He tried to present the arrest as a reasonable response to a developing situation. The report did not match the video. That mismatch turned a bad stop into a bigger case. It was no longer only about profiling and illegal arrest. It was also about whether Kessler had exaggerated or falsified parts of his justification after the fact. Internal Affairs opened an investigation. At that point, the department was dealing with a clean evidence problem. The footage was clear. The audio was clear. The paperwork was clear. Kessler's explanation was the weak part of the record, not the strong part. News of the stop started spreading through the hospital system first. Then city officials heard about it. Lawyers got involved after that. Local media followed quickly because the core facts were simple and hard to defend. A black surgeon had been arrested in his own car, even though the documents were valid and the car was not stolen. There was no good way to explain that. Kessler had treated the car itself like a reason to suspect crime. He had treated his own disbelief like grounds to keep pushing. That approach held up on the roadside, only because he had the badge and Dr. Adrian Mercer stayed calm. It did not hold up once the evidence was reviewed by other people. By then, the stop was no longer about what Kessler thought he saw that night. It was about what the department could clearly prove he had done. Once Internal Affairs had the full record, Officer Daniel Kessler's position became very weak very fast. This was not a complicated case. The department had the body camera, the dash footage, the dispatch audio, the registration records, and Kessler's report. Those pieces should have supported each other if the stop had been lawful. They did not. The video showed a calm and cooperative driver. The records showed valid ownership. The audio showed Kessler building suspicion before he had evidence. The report tried to justify an arrest that the rest of the record did not support. That is why the case collapsed. The department could not defend the arrest as a close judgment call. There was no probable cause for vehicle theft. There was no basis to treat the registration as fake. There was no behavior from Dr. Adrian Mercer that justified turning a traffic stop into handcuffs. Once that was clear, The department had to face the next issue. Kessler had not just made a bad decision. He had pushed past the legal limit of his authority and then tried to explain it in a way that did not match the footage. That is what ended his career there. Internal Affairs concluded that he had made an illegal arrest, acted without lawful cause, and exaggerated key parts of his justification. The department fired him. They could not keep him after that without accepting the risk that every future arrest, report, and courtroom appearance tied to his name would be attacked through this stop. Once an officer loses credibility that cleanly, the badge becomes hard to defend. Kessler had started that night thinking he could control the scene because he had authority, and Dr. Adrian Mercer was alone on the roadside. In the end, that same stop became the record that destroyed him. Not because anyone had to invent anything. Because the cameras were on, the documents were real, and his own decisions were bad enough to stand on their own. Dr. Adrian Mercer did not stop at the firing. He sued Kessler and the department for illegal arrest, racial profiling, and violation of his civil rights. That lawsuit was the next problem, and it was serious. The stop was already public by then. The facts were already easy to explain. A black man was pulled over in his own car, gave valid documents, stayed calm, and still ended up in handcuffs because an officer decided the car did not fit the driver. That is a case people understand immediately. The department now had to defend not just the stop, but the choices around it. Why the detention was extended. Why the radio traffic sounded the way it did. Why the arrest happened without real evidence. Why the report did not match the recordings. Those questions kept the incident alive because there was no simple answer that made the officer's conduct look reasonable. That was the real damage. Kessler lost his job, but the consequences went beyond him. The department came under pressure to explain training, supervision, and how an officer felt comfortable taking a stop that far with so little factual support. People started asking whether this was truly one officer acting alone, or whether he had simply done in public what had gone unchecked in smaller stops before. That is the kind of pressure departments hate because it moves the story from one man's misconduct to the culture around him. The hospital system did not let the matter fade either. Dr. Adrian Mercer was too visible, too established, and too careful in the way he handled the stop for the department to dismiss him as a difficult driver or a misunderstanding. He had done everything right. That made the case stronger. It removed the usual excuses. There was no aggressive behavior to point to, no refusal to comply, no confusion in ownership records, just a biased assumption, an illegal arrest, and a report that could not survive review. That is why the ending was satisfying. Officer Daniel Kessler thought he was dealing with someone he could intimidate and define on the spot. He thought he could turn disbelief into authority and authority into custody. Instead, he created a clean record of misconduct. It cost him his badge. It pulled him into court. It put his conduct under a microscope he could not control. And that is the real lesson here. This story was never about a car by itself. It was about what happens when an officer sees a person, decides they do not belong where they are, and then uses police power to force that belief into action. The reason Kessler lost in the end was simple. He had no facts. He had a bias, and he acted on it anyway. Once the footage was reviewed, the uniform could not protect him from what he had done. A lot of officers count on the moment being all that matters. They count on pressure, confusion, and the assumption that their version will carry more weight than the driver's. That works until the evidence is clear enough. Then the whole thing flips. The same stop they thought they controlled becomes the proof against them. That is exactly what happened here. Let me know what you would have done in Dr. Adrian Mercer's position. And if you have ever seen a stop like this turn into something it never should have become, put your thoughts in the comments. Share the story with somebody who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories like this.
All right, both of you, IDs, right now.
What's the reason?
You're in an area with break-ins. I need to know who you are.
Just standing here is not suspicious. What specific facts made you stop us?
You two look like you're scouting, like you're casing places.
That's not a fact, that's a guess.
Start me a second unit, possible drug activity.
The The Mesa officer thought he was stopping just another black couple he could pressure, confuse, and send on their way with no questions asked. He had no idea he was already talking himself into a record, into radio traffic he couldn't clean up later, and into a stop that another officer was about to examine line by line. What he tried to sell as a routine contact was already turning into the kind of encounter that exposes exactly how bad stops happen in the first place. Before this goes further, drop where you're watching from in the comments. And if you follow stories about accountability, bad stops, and people who know how to hold their ground without losing control, hit like and subscribe. This started in Mesa, Arizona, in a quiet commercial area that didn't give the officer much to work with. Parked cars, storefronts, low traffic, no crowd, no active disturbance. Edward Ellison and Tiana Ellison were standing there like countless other people stand near businesses every day, talking and minding their own business. Nothing dramatic. That's what made what happened next so telling. The officer rolled up and skipped right past normal contact. He didn't come in like someone checking on a situation. He came in like he'd already decided what they were. His first move was control, identification, questions framed like commands. Then the real tell came out fast. He started implying that they didn't fit the area, not directly at first. Officers who do this a lot usually don't say the ugliest part immediately. They circle it. They let the suspicion hang in the air and act like everyone is supposed to understand what they mean without them having to say it clean. Edward and Tiana caught it right away. They didn't match his energy. That mattered. A lot of people think the turning point in these encounters comes when voices rise. Sometimes it does. Here it came because the couple refused to help him build the stop for himself. They stayed calm and made him do the work. Edward asked what legal basis he had for stopping them. Tiana asked whether they were actually being detained. Very simple questions. The kind that sound almost too basic until an officer can't answer them. And he couldn't. Instead of naming a crime, he drifted into theory. He suggested they might be scouting homes or businesses. That was the first invented layer, not based on a report, not based on observed tools, forced entry, masks, lookout behavior, or anything real. Just a theory built around presence. Two black people standing in a place where, in his view, they needed to explain themselves. That was the engine under the whole thing. Tiana quietly started recording audio. That decision changed everything, even though the officer didn't know it yet. That's how a lot of these encounters work. The person trying to control the scene thinks the moment belongs to him because he has the badge, the radio, the uniform, the official posture. But the record starts moving in another direction. A phone in a hand, audio running, timestamps, tone, word choice. What was asked? What was dodged? What got added later? Once that exists, the story doesn't belong only to the officer anymore. Edward kept pressing the same point. Not arguing all over the place. Not taking the bait. Just bringing it back. What crime was being investigated? Were they free to leave? What facts created suspicion? The officer still wouldn't answer straight. He pushed harder instead. That's another bad sign. When an officer has lawful grounds, he usually states them. When he doesn't, he often tries to replace legal clarity with pressure. Then he called for backup, and he made it worse. Over the radio, he added possible drug activity. Just dropped it into the encounter like he needed a heavier label to justify the direction this was going. No drug scene, no suspicious items, no exchange, no odor described, no paraphernalia, no actual criminal conduct. Nothing in the situation as described supported that leap. He just needed something uglier, something that would make the stop sound more defensible once other units started listening. That's the part officers sometimes forget. Radio traffic isn't just theater for the moment. It's evidence later. Once a false narrative enters the log, it can either be supported or it can collapse. There isn't much room in between. Edward and Tiana heard the shift. So did anyone who would have reviewed the dispatch trail later. The stop had now moved from vague suspicion to active narrative building. Same encounter, same empty facts, bigger accusation. The officer kept trying to make them play the role he'd assigned them. He wanted nervousness. He wanted overreaction. He wanted one bad sentence, one angry move, one excuse to say his instincts had been right all along. He didn't get it. Tiana stayed steady. Edward stayed direct. They didn't help him fix the holes in his own stop. That's what made the scene more dangerous for him, even if he didn't realize it yet. Because once a stop like this fails to produce facts, the officer has two choices: end it or double down. He doubled down. By then, the whole contact had become something bigger than one patrol officer talking too much in a parking area. It was turning into a test of who could actually carry the burden of truth once more the people got involved. The first officer was betting on the usual outcome. Backup arrives, uniforms align. The original version gets protected. The civilians get outnumbered and worn down. That bet was about to fail. The next officer coming in wasn't walking into a clean scene. He was walking into a stop built on shifting claims, unanswered legal questions, and a drug reference that didn't match any visible fact. And Edward and Tiana weren't standing there confused about what was happening. They were tracking every piece of it, calmly, precisely. The first officer still thought he had time to shape the story. He didn't, because the second officer, Daniel Reeves, was about to ask the exact kind of simple professional questions that bad stops never survive. Officer Daniel Reeves arrived expecting the usual thing: a patrol officer making contact, a couple of civilians, some explanation that would sound thin but usable. That's probably what the first officer expected too. He'd already laid the groundwork over the radio. Possible casing, possible drug activity. Enough loaded language to make the stop sound more serious than it was. But Reeves didn't just absorb the first version and move on. He started asking basic questions, the kind that should have been answered immediately if the stop had any real foundation. What exactly had been observed? What crime was being investigated? Who had reported it? What specific facts led to the drug reference? Had either of them been seen handling narcotics, exchanging items, hiding contraband, trying to flee, or doing anything that pointed to an actual offense? The first officer had no clean answer. He kept circling back to impressions, presence, vibes, the area, how they looked standing there, how long they'd been there. It was weak, worse than weak. It sounded like a man trying to reverse engineer reasonable suspicion after he'd already made the stop. And Reeves could see it. That changed the whole energy of the scene. Not loudly, not dramatically. This wasn't one officer openly dressing another one down in front of civilians. It was subtler than that, more damaging too. Reeves kept it professional. He asked short questions. He stuck to facts. He didn't rescue the first officer by adding his own assumptions. That alone started stripping the stop down to what it really was. Edward and Tiana noticed it right away. They could tell Reeves wasn't eager to rubber stamp what had already happened. He wasn't hostile toward them. He wasn't performing solidarity for the first officer. He was looking for something objective he could write down and defend later. He wasn't finding it. The first officer felt the shift, too. And this is where officers like that often get themselves in deeper trouble. Instead of backing out cleanly, he started trying to soften his earlier language without fully letting it go. He hinted that it was just a field interview, just a routine check, just making contact in an area where businesses and homes mattered, just trying to be proactive. That might have worked if he hadn't already gone further, but he had. He'd already implied they didn't belong there. He'd already floated the theory that they were scouting locations for crime. He'd already injected drugs into the radio traffic. Once an officer does that, he can't casually rewind the encounter and pretend it was community policing. Reeves kept asking, had there been a complainant? No clear answer. Had either person admitted to anything? No. Had the first officer seen contraband? No. Had they tried to leave after being told they were detained for a specific crime? That question hung there, because the first officer still hadn't clearly established any lawful detention in the first place. That's the part that usually gets buried in stories like this. People talk about attitude, tone, respect, officer safety, all the vague language that lets bad stops breathe. But the real center of it is simple. What specific articulable facts existed? At the moment the officer decided these two people weren't just citizens standing in public, but potential criminals who needed to identify themselves and justify being there. Reeves was effectively forcing that question into the open, and there still wasn't a real answer. Edward stayed locked in. He didn't start grandstanding just because another officer seemed more professional. He kept it narrow. Legal basis. Facts. Detained or not detained. He wasn't trying to win the street argument. He was making sure nobody could later pretend this had been some chaotic misunderstanding. Tiana did the same. Calm, focused. Recording, still running. Then the stop broke open. Edward and Tiana presented federal credentials. Not in some flashy way, not as a threat. They didn't suddenly become louder or smug. They just produced identification that changed what the first officer thought he was dealing with. Tiana's credentials tied her to civil rights work. And in that moment, the first officer understood something ugly all at once. This wasn't going to stay trapped inside his version of events. These weren't two people he could intimidate, delay, or confuse until they gave up and left. They knew exactly what mattered. Records mattered. Language mattered. Sequence mattered. Every claim he'd made was now a potential exhibit. His tone changed immediately. That's always revealing. Not because authority should only be respected when a person has status. That's the whole problem. He hadn't treated them like ordinary people entitled to ordinary rights. He'd treated them like convenient suspects until he saw credentials he associated with consequence. Then suddenly he sounded measured, more polite, more casual, more interested in wrapping things up without friction. Too late. Reeves had already seen enough. The recording already existed. The radio traffic already existed. And Edward and Tiana had just shown that they were not only calm under pressure, but fully prepared to follow the paper trail after the stop ended. The first officer started trying to repackage the contact. He suggested it was all routine. Standard. No big deal. Just checking. Just making sure everything was okay. But that version couldn't survive the timeline. Routine contacts don't usually start with demands unsupported by clear facts. They don't usually involve telling people they don't fit the area. They don't usually develop into unsupported theories about casing property. And they definitely don't suddenly add drug suspicion over the radio for no factual reason. The whole thing was now sitting in plain view. A bad stop. A changing story. A backup officer who wouldn't decorate it with fake certainty. That's when command had to enter the scene. Because once an encounter starts unraveling in front of multiple officers, somebody higher usually gets called to contain the damage. A sergeant arrived. By then, the first officer had lost the core battle. Not the ego battle, the factual one. The sergeant wasn't arriving to a blank slate. He was arriving to a stop where another officer had already been asking why the legal basis didn't make sense, where the couple remained composed, and where the original officer's own radio language was now part of the problem. Tiana didn't waste time. She formally stated that she had a full audio recording of the encounter. Then she laid out exactly what would happen next. Body camera footage would be requested. CAD records would be requested. Dispatch logs would be requested. There would be an internal complaint and a full investigation into the detention. That was the moment the stop fully flipped. Not because anyone raised their voice. Not because the first officer got publicly humiliated in some dramatic movie scene way. It flipped because the tools of accountability were now on the table in a specific, informed, unavoidable way. Recording, logs, video, supervisor awareness, a witness officer who had already made clear there was no solid basis for what happened. And Reeves didn't blur it to protect the stop. He confirmed in substance that there was no valid basis for detention. That's a brutal thing for a bad stop. Once that gets acknowledged on scene by another officer, the original version starts dying before the report is even written. The sergeant had very little room left. He couldn't credibly turn the couple into the problem. They were calm, consistent, precise. He couldn't sell the stop as some fast-moving uncertainty. There was no real offense driving it, just an officer who saw a black couple in a quiet area and started building suspicion around their existence. So the pressure changed direction. Not openly, but it changed. The question was no longer what Edward and Tiana were doing there. The question was what the first officer thought he was doing. The sergeant understood the problem fast. Not because the first officer explained it well. He didn't. The sergeant understood it because the stop had already been stripped down to its weak parts before he got there. No clear reported crime, no specific observed conduct, no real explanation for why drug activity had suddenly gone over the radio. And now a full audio recording sitting in Tiana's possession. That changes the scene fast. The first officer still tried to shrink what happened. He pushed a safer version now. He acted like it had been a basic contact that got misunderstood. He tried to flatten the escalation and make the whole thing sound administrative. That wasn't going to hold. Not with Reeves there. Not with the couple staying consistent. Not with the sequence already laid out in real time. Tiana made it plain that they weren't interested in arguing on the sidewalk. They were interested in records. She stated that they would be requesting the body camera footage, the CAD entries, the dispatch audio, the unit history, and the incident documentation tied to the stop. She also made clear that her audio recording captured the officer's shifting reasoning from the beginning. That's when the first officer really lost control of the encounter. He couldn't fix the timeline anymore. He couldn't smooth over what he said first by changing his tone at the end. Edward stayed the same way he'd been the whole time. Calm, focused, no speech, no performance. He kept it on one issue. There had been no lawful basis to turn them into suspects. That was the point. Everything else was cleanup. Reeves didn't retreat from what he'd already made clear. He confirmed in front of the sergeant that there was no valid basis for detention based on what had been personally observed. That mattered more than people realize. Internal cases often turn on whether someone inside the system is willing to say the obvious before the paperwork gets massaged. Reeves did. He didn't make a scene. He didn't need to. He just didn't help bury it. At that point, the sergeant did the only thing left to do. He ended the stop. Edward and Tiana were released. No citation, no warning, no contraband, no criminal referral, no supporting facts for the drug claim. Nothing. The entire encounter had started with suspicion and ended with emptiness. That's usually the clearest sign that the suspicion was never real in the first place. And that's where some people think the story ends. Couple gets released, bad stop over, everybody goes home. Not this time. Because the real damage for the first officer started after the scene was quiet again. Edward and Tiana followed through. They didn't let the encounter turn into one of those stories people tell privately and never document. They moved fast. Records requests went in. The audio was preserved. Notes were made while every detail was still fresh. Times, sequence, exact shifts in language. The point where the officer suggested they didn't fit the area. The point where he floated the casing theory. The point where drug activity suddenly appeared with no factual basis. The point where Reeves started asking the questions the first officer couldn't answer. The point where the tone changed after credentials came out. Every important move had a place on the timeline. That made it dangerous for the department to dismiss. Internal investigators had a simple problem in front of them. If the officer's version was legitimate, the evidence should support it. The body camera should show objective facts. The CAD notes should line up with the stated basis for the stop. The dispatch traffic should reflect actual observations. The secondary officer's account should reinforce the original decision. That's what would have saved him. It didn't. The review started focusing on the gap between what he claimed and what he actually had. Investigators looked at the stop itself, then started widening the lens. Prior contacts, radio traffic patterns, similar incidents. Other times he escalated vague encounters into criminal suspicion without clear legal grounds. That kind of review is where trouble gets real, because one bad stop can be explained away by people who want to protect the badge. A pattern is harder to hide. And the patterns started to matter. Supervisors had to ask why this officer kept turning thin observations into heavier accusations. Why ordinary presence kept becoming detention pressure. Why unsupported criminal theories kept showing up in his field contacts. Why the language in his stops seemed to grow more serious whenever he needed cover for an encounter that began with almost nothing. He got pulled from street duty while the investigation moved forward. That wasn't the final consequence, but it was the first public sign that the department understood this couldn't just be brushed aside as a misunderstanding. Street duty is trust. Once that trust gets questioned inside the department, everything tightens around the officer. Reports get read differently. Old contacts get revisited. Supervisors stop assuming judgment and start checking it. The case also spread beyond internal channels. What happened to Edward and Tiana got discussed the way these incidents usually do when they hit a nerve. First among people who already knew how these stops happen. Then among people who had their own stories. Same structure, same tactics. Officer sees someone and decides they don't belong, pressures them for identification, invents a theory, then goes fishing for something bigger when challenged. People recognize the pattern because they'd lived versions of it. The only difference here was that this one had cleaner evidence than most. That's why the recording mattered so much. Without it, the first officer could have leaned on the usual defense. He could have said the couple seemed evasive. He could have said there were indicators that didn't fully translate into a report. He could have claimed his radio language got misunderstood in a fluid situation. He could have hidden behind officer safety and proactive policing and all the other catchphrases that make bad stops harder to challenge. The recording boxed him in. Reeves boxed him in too. That combination was brutal. One record from outside the department, one witness from inside it. Same basic conclusion. The suspicion didn't come from facts. The facts were being invented to support the suspicion. That's the heart of the story. The officer didn't lose because Edward and Tiana had status. He didn't lose because they produced federal credentials. He'd already lost before that, really. He lost because he tried to build a criminal narrative around a black couple doing nothing wrong. And that narrative got preserved before he could rewrite it. The credentials just made him realize too late that the people in front of him knew exactly how to force the system to answer for it. And that part matters. A lot. Because rights aren't supposed to depend on whether the person stopped knows civil rights procedure, knows records law, knows how dispatch logs work, or has a second officer willing to tell the truth. Ordinary people deserve lawful treatment too. The story hits hard because it shows how often accountability still depends on preparation, documentation, and somebody refusing to play along with a false frame. Edward and Tiana didn't win by outshouting him. They didn't win by getting emotional and trying to beat a badge with volume. They won by staying locked on facts, by not letting the officer turn the encounter into a personality contest, by recording, by asking the same legal questions he didn't want to answer, by understanding that oversight starts the second someone decides to preserve the truth instead of trusting the system to do it for them. That's why the stop fell apart. Not because the officer had a sudden change of heart. He changed tone only when he saw possible consequences. That's an important detail, and people shouldn't look away from it. He treated them one way when he thought they were easy targets. He treated them another way when he thought they had institutional power behind them. That switch told the whole story on its own. In the end, the officer tried to turn an ordinary moment into criminal suspicion. He tried to make presence sound like planning. He tried to make a weak stop sound serious by adding drugs to the radio. He tried to lean on the usual assumption that once police language enters the record first, it controls the story. He was wrong. The record beat him. The questions beat him. The facts beat him. And that's the lesson here. When somebody in authority starts building a case out of nothing, the smartest response isn't panic, it's precision. Know what was said. Know what was observed. Know what changed. Know what can be requested later. Once the false narrative gets checked against the actual sequence, a lot of power disappears fast. So that's the story. A Mesa patrol officer thought he had found just another couple he could pressure without consequence. What he actually found was a clean record, a professional witness, and two people who understood that accountability starts before the stop is even over. What would you have done in that situation? Have you ever seen an officer try to create suspicion first and look for facts later? Put your thoughts in the comments. Share the story with somebody who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories